Hello and welcome back to the course Life of Christ. Today we're in class 7, which has two parts. We're continuing to set up some of the background of the culture and the history and the geography of Jesus' ministry in Israel. Today we want to begin by talking about the important people groups that were around in the time of Jesus. In the first part of this, we'll talk about the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And then in the second part, we'll talk about other groups as well. I want to mention some different ideas that we may have had about the time between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. As you know, Malachi is the last book, both in the Bible and also chronologically, of the Old Testament. About 400 BC, around there, is when Malachi lived and prophesied there. From then until the time of about 0 AD, when Jesus was born, a few years perhaps on the front side of that, we have a situation where we don't have any written books in the Bible that tell us about what happened with the Jews during that time. So it's 400 years of something. I've heard this called, this intertestamental period, I've heard it called 400 years of silence, because there are no prophets that we know of in the Bible that cover that time. But actually, if you look at secular history during that time, and we know from a number of other books written during and about that time, there was actually quite a bit going on, and it wouldn't be accurate to call it entirely silent. Other people may have thought, well, it was maybe not silent totally, but it was inactive. You know, God wasn't working actively for his people or through his people during that time. And again, I think there'd be some trouble with that. There, again, are other accounts of what happened in the land of Israel, both written during that time and about that time, that indicate God actually was active. And then sometimes the Jews themselves, especially, may have thought these were 400 years of abandonment. Perhaps these were times when they wondered if God had forgotten his promises or his covenant, or if they thought he remembered it, but he had now decided to discard them as a people because they'd been unfaithful in so many different ways over the years. And yet, I don't think that's exactly accurate either. Some people may have called them 400 years of infidelity, because even though we see toward the end of the Old Testament the people coming back from the Babylonian exile and beginning to reestablish the temple and the services and the sacrifices. And there was faithfulness to a large extent, yet there were also stories of the old infidelity creeping in, the intermarriage with people who didn't believe at all about God, the idol worship and things like that, that made people wonder, is this the same story repeating? Could it be 400 years of infidelity? But I tend to think of this time as 400 years of preparation, ideas and people groups and actions that set up the New Testament to pick up the story of the people of God and move it on forward into the Gospels and the time of the early church. Preparation. And so in this class, one of the things we want to look at are the people groups that were important during this time. Many began during these 400 years and then carried over into the time of Jesus. If you finish reading the Old Testament, for example, you won't see the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Essenes or anybody, but you will see them in the New Testament. And if you just go from Malachi to Matthew and you start reading, you say, who are these people all of a sudden? Where'd they come from? And so today we want to cover some of where they came from. So, taking you through those 5 points there already. Here's the complete list of the groups we'll cover during this class, 7 different groups, and this first part will take the first 3 of those. If you go to the Sadducees, they were the earliest of these groups to develop, really just after the end of the Old Testament, about 400 BC, so you can go along filling in these spaces as we go. And one of their nicknames of their group was the Righteous Ones. That was kind of a derivation of Tzadok, which in Hebrew is righteous. And you can see how that's similar to Sadducees. The Righteous Ones, because they wanted to go back and restore the temple worship and sacrifices and practices exactly as it should have been. They were dismayed about how the people had fallen away from following the law. And so they went back and they were in charge of the temple and the sacrifices. Now, if you look at some of the passages there in the New Testament, you see them mentioned in those, and you get some crumbs of information about them. But these were the men whose primary task was to make sure everything ran smoothly in the temple. And so when you see Jesus in conflict with them, it's often about something to do with the temple. I imagine the Sadducees, for example, were not at all thrilled when Jesus came and upset all the tables and let animals loose in the temple. That directly affected the work of the Sadducees, and they were not happy at all about that. The word of God for them was just the Torah, just the teaching. That's Torah, what we would call maybe more normally the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That was the word. The prophets they saw as perhaps men who spoke and tried to help the people, but they didn't put the prophets in the same category as the Pentateuch or the Torah there. Another characteristic we find out from some of these passages that we mentioned above is that they did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees are the group that came to Jesus in Matthew 22 and asked the question about in heaven, what's the deal with marriage? Whose wife will this one woman be who married 7 men while on earth? Whose wife will she be in heaven? They were trying to show how ridiculous that idea of a resurrection and a heaven were. It would create all kinds of problems. So that's the Sadducees. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead, or of angels. They also collaborated with the Herodians and the Romans. And that makes sense because both the Herodians and the Romans were concerned about the political structure and the power that was there in Jerusalem as how it related to the rest of the Roman Empire. And so they wanted to make sure that they maintained their own power in the temple and all that went with the temple. And so they had to cooperate with and were often in league with the Herodians and the Romans. And we'll talk more about the Herodians a little bit more later. Another thing that the Sadducees did was they affirmed human liberty, but they denied divine action in the world. Their idea might have been kind of deistic, deism, as you may have heard of before, where God creates the world and he sets it up and he starts it running like you wind up a watch, but then after that you walk away from it and just let it run. So they believed that humans had great power and great liberty to act as they wanted, but really didn't see how God was involved in the world. So that's one group, the Sadducees, an important group that are in the New Testament. Then you have the Pharisees, and the space here is their name. Another nickname was the separated ones, and that actually has to do with their name in Hebrew. They believed that the Sadducees had also gotten corrupt. This group appeared around 150 BC, so it's about 250 years after the Sadducees, approximately. And they said, we need to correct all the abuses of the Sadducees. And we want to separate ourselves from that corruption, from the lack of obedience, and really get it right. We want to follow the law in great detail. And so there's a group of about 6,000 people, such as Nicodemus and Gamaliel, and we hear about, should be Gamaliel, not Galamiel. We hear about in Acts, and there were some very good men in this group that truly wanted to be faithful to the Lord and do what was right. We see these two men's good hearts in their conversations in the Gospels and in Acts. And so they just wanted to live their lives without being contaminated by the world and its ways. The Pharisees also followed the Torah of God, preserving the law, but they also believed in the prophets as well and the wisdom literature. And they had a group of people that worked with them, kind of the academics that helped them keep a lot of this straight, was the group of scribes. And so you remember in the New Testament, often you'll see the phrase the scribes and the Pharisees. That's because they worked together on interpreting the law and keeping the law. Kind of the scribes were kind of the academic officers, in a sense, of the law. And the Pharisees also valued tradition, not just what was in the law or the prophets or the wisdom literature, but the traditions that had developed over the centuries with certain practices of the law or certain beliefs about how things should be done within the synagogues and within the temple. And they would tend to give it the same value or even more value perhaps than the written law. And so you have cases like Matthew 15 where Jesus criticizes the Pharisees because he sees them giving more value and more importance to their traditions over what the law clearly says. So the Pharisees, very important group as well during the time of Jesus. Now I want to point out quickly the different conflicts that the Pharisees had with different people. For example, with the Sadducees, but also with Jesus himself. For example, you had this conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees based on class, especially wealthy Sadducees, and also the poor Sadducees, or just the poor in general. You had conflicts based on the culture. Some people that favored more Hellenization, being more like the Greek culture of the time, and there were those who opposed Hellenization entirely. They thought it was very pagan and totally missed the spirit and practice of the law of the Jews. And then there were some Pharisees and Sadducees that clashed over what we call the juridico-religious groups. And this was more of a subdivision within the group. Those who emphasized the importance of the temple, that's more the Sadducees, versus the law and the prophets, which would be more the Pharisees, especially when they talked about the importance of the prophets. And so again, you see that these two groups themselves had trouble with each other in a number of areas. And in fact, Paul, when he's on trial in Acts 23, he plays on this and he says, I'm just here because of my belief in the resurrection of the dead. And he knows there's Pharisees and Sadducees there present listening to him. And sure enough, they begin to argue about that very fact, which they don't agree with. And Paul was basically let off, at least in that particular instance. So a lot of conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then you have Jesus' relationship with the Sadducees, with the Pharisees, I'm sorry. He was in agreement with them in many ways. As I said, many of these men were good men that really sincerely tried to follow the law. But they would tend to conflict with each other in certain areas, especially the traditions, as we mentioned before, or when they disobeyed the spirit of the law, like in Matthew 23. And so basically you could say that Jesus differed with them in 4 different points. One was a different concept of separation. What did it mean to be separate from sin? Did that mean that you were separate from everything that had to do with any kind of sin, including people, right? Or was it just separation from practices? And so, for example, Jesus is seen with sinners, Luke 15, 1 and following, and the Pharisees are scandalized. You know, this man eats with sinners. What's wrong with him? But for Jesus, that wasn't his concept of separation. He wanted to be with sinners. He says, I came to heal the sinners. The doctor comes to heal the sick. A second thing where Jesus differed with the Pharisees was in ritual purity. And again, I mentioned Matthew 15. The Pharisees emphasized traditions too much. The way that they would give money to the temple, for example, instead of helping their parents with it. That's the specific instance. Or maybe the washing of the hands that the Pharisees thought was so important and criticized Jesus for not doing. Or amount of fasting that they did. Why do your disciples not fast and the disciples of John the Baptist fast? So you see differences in these kind of rituals and practices. Third, Jesus differed with them on how they kept the Sabbath. We're going to have a whole class about the Sabbath. But just briefly, if you look at passages like Matthew 12 and Luke chapter 6, you see that the Pharisees and Jesus had totally different ideas about what was possible or permissible on the Sabbath for a faithful Jew. And then a fourth area, the concept of divorce, was pretty different as well. In Matthew 19, you have the Pharisees saying, well, Moses told us to do this, and Jesus said Moses permitted this, and they would even, talk about the differences in the verbs there, which are pretty significant. And so you see that Jesus and the Pharisees were quite distant from each other in that particular topic. Those are the main ideas, but there are others, of course, that you may see, but those cover most of what we're talking about here. So we have the Sadducees and then the Pharisees. And then you had the Essenes, and their nickname was the pious ones, And they were founded also about 150 BC. And they were also concerned about the purity and following the law as well as they could. And they also thought that perhaps the Pharisees didn't even get it right. And so the Essenes really were going to get it right. They wanted to make sure that they were pure. And to do it, they said, we can't even really necessarily be in Jerusalem with all the people at the temple. We need to get out of the temple and away and live by ourselves. And only then can we really know what it's like to be pure and to live the way that we think we should. Now, they were led by a group of priests, led by a teacher of justice, and they were a group of priests that followed this man, the teacher of justice. And so they left the temple service, and they went to 3 different places. One place was on Mount Zion, which is pretty near the temple. Another place was in Syria, near Damascus, and we don't know exactly where those 2 are today. But then a third place they went was at Qumran. And if you've done any Bible study in the New Testament, you've probably heard the name of Qumran because those ruins are still present today. And you can go see them and see a museum about their history. And from Qumran, we actually learn a lot about the life of the Essenes in community down near the Dead Sea. And we'll show you some pictures of those. Some people even believe that the family of Jesus was influenced by the Essenes. In fact, some people think that the family of Zechariah, Elizabeth, and their son, John the Baptist, were Essenes. And there's some information, some evidence for that. And that's interesting because we know that, for example, the Qumran community had been there for quite a while. They were on the shore of the Dead Sea, and it's not very far at all from where John the Baptist appears preaching in the wilderness. In fact, if you go to the north part of the Dead Sea, it may be like 5 miles, not even that far, from the Qumran up to where the Jordan River comes into the Dead Sea. And we know that John the Baptist was baptizing near that spot in the Jordan River. So it could be that part of his formation as a man of God was at Qumran, and then he went out from there to begin his ministry in the wilderness of Judea. It's a possibility. Nobody is absolutely sure, but it's an interesting thing to think about. So I want to show you some things about Qumran and where it is exactly. If you look at this slide over here, you see the Dead Sea back in the time of Jesus inside this rectangle here. And then Qumran is almost at the very top. If it were an elongated clock, you're looking at maybe 11 o'clock or 11:30 on the clock where Qumran is, very near the shores of the Dead Sea. Then you see the Jordan River right here going north, and about right around here where the red rectangle is the spot where they think Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. So you can see how John could have been connected with this community. Now, if you look in the desert itself, you see this picture to the right, and that's a pretty accurate picture of how that whole area looks. Hills or small mountains, a lot of dirt, a lot of rocks. You see Bedouins in some tents scattered through here with their flocks as well, but just not a lot to do. And so you go on and you see the area of Qumran. Kirbet means like village. And so you see to the top left more of a close-up of the ruins that they found of this community. Pretty well preserved ruins, really. And then a little bit more of a zoom out on the bottom right there. If you go to the next one, you see more from the height of the mountains that are near Qumran. You see basically all this group of trees around this white area. That's the current place today where the visitor center is and a museum. And out just to the right of it here is the community of Qumran from the first century. Then, of course, you see the Dead Sea in the distance, and it's very likely that the Dead Sea was a lot closer to Qumran. In fact, it could have almost been on the very shores of the Dead Sea during the time of Jesus. You also see around Qumran in the mountains and the hills right beside it, many caves, hundreds of caves in this area. And what we're looking at here, basically in the center of this cave, right about here, is Cave 1, called that because that's the first cave where they found what became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the story is that some young shepherds, and these are the two shepherds, and they're a little bit older in this picture than they were at the time. But the story is that they were out taking care of the sheep and the goats. And as you saw in the previous pictures, there's not a lot to do out there if you're bored. And so the story is that they were throwing rocks to see if they could throw rocks into the mouth of the cave that was near where they were with their goats. And as they did that with one rock, they heard something break as the rock landed inside. And they thought, well, I wonder what that was. It sounds kind of like a jar breaking. And there were legends and stories about robbers who had hidden loot and gold and coins in these caves. And they thought, we found a treasure. And they were right. They just didn't know what kind of treasure. So they scramble up to the cave and they look inside. And to their disappointment, they find just some old leather scrolls and a broken jar. And I don't remember exactly how many scrolls were in that first cave. But anyway, they grabbed them. And according to what I heard about the story, they said, well, this isn't worth what we thought, but let's take them over. There's a cobbler in Bethlehem named Kando. And let's take him to him. This is about 1947 that we're talking about. Let's take him to Kando, and we need some new sandals. Maybe he'll take these leather things here, they didn't even know what they were, and maybe he can make us some new sandals out of it. So they go to Bethlehem, to Kando's store, and they explain the situation, and he looks at him and he realizes there's writing on these leather scrolls. And so he says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you $25 for these. And then I'll give you new sandals each. And if you find any more of these, if you could bring them back to me, then I'll pay you for them as well. And so they're really excited. They got out and they got their sandals out and everything. And it turns out that, of course, they began to find more and more of these scrolls. They realized they're very ancient scrolls with Hebrew on them. And then they start to find more and more in the caves. And they start to realize these must have been scrolls hidden in those caves by somebody, and they didn't know at first who they were. Then they sent the scrolls off to be tested and analyzed and studied by scholars in Israel. And several years later, in the 1950s, they realized these were actually scrolls written, copied from much earlier scrolls by the Essenes in the community at Qumran. And they would work every day on copying these scrolls. They were kind of like, in some ways, a publishing house that would copy scrolls and send scrolls and sell them to different synagogues around Israel. So if you needed a new copy of Isaiah, for example, you'd send to the community of Essenes at Qumran, and you could get new scrolls for your synagogue. And that's part of how they made their living at the time. And so they realized, hey, these scrolls are very old and very valuable, because they let us compare the Bible that we have now in the 1950s at that time to the Bible that was written way back, copied way back in the first century, or maybe even a few before the first century, parts of the Old Testament. And it was at the same time a very exciting discovery, but also a little bit scary, because what if you compare the 1955 Bible with the Bible or the version from 70 AD or 50 AD, and they're not anywhere similar? What would that mean for our Bible that we have and the inspiration of the Bible? And they compared the scrolls, and they found they were just almost exactly identical, just some really small differences in the text. And so it confirmed the authenticity of the biblical text that we have, that they'd been transmitted down almost 2,000 years, and they were still reliable and genuine. So again, the major discovery of archaeology of the 20th century. One of our guides in Israel told the story. He says he was raised in Bethlehem, and he actually taught at the Bethlehem Bible College for a while, and he says he actually knew the grandsons of these two shepherds. And he says that when they found out how valuable the scrolls were, I think they said they sold the scrolls for millions of pounds at that time, maybe 5 million British pounds back in the 1950s. When they found out that they had basically given those scrolls away to Kendo and only got sandals and $25, that one of them had a heart attack and died right then. Now, I don't know if that's a true story, but that's the story from our guide, and normally he's been pretty reliable. So interesting story there, just underlining the importance of these scrolls in biblical history and biblical study. Now I want to show you just a little bit about Qumran as we go. This is kind of a recreation that they've done of what it might have looked like in the days of the Essenes in the 1st century AD. You have a really important room here, the scriptorium in the middle, which is where they would sit and copy the different scrolls from the Old Testament. And there were other books that they also wrote at the time. Then you have over here the kitchen, you have the pantry, you have then across the valley, you have the caves over here where they hid some of the scrolls afterwards, the whole connection with the water system. This is what they think it looked like. And then if you go to the next slide, you see that it's really similar. They based it on what they've seen. So this is Qumran as you would see if you went today. Now, there's something I want to share with you. Again, it's another one of these 360 videos. So I'm going to pull up our first one here of Qumran, and I'll show you several different parts of Qumran. All right, you should be seeing now what you have in Qumran. And again, I'm just going to kind of spin around here. We're standing in the middle of the community of Qumran there today. You can see as you kind of spin the camera around the Dead Sea in the distance and about how far it is away today from the actual community. And you keep on spinning around, you start to see below us some of the original part of the community at Qumran. You see the scriptorium on through here, just other areas, other rooms that you saw on the map there just before. And then as you keep on spinning toward the west, you begin to see these low mountains that are all along the Dead Sea to the west of the Dead Sea. And you can see just barely some of the caves that are in these mountains. And there's hundreds of them all up and down this range along the Dead Sea. And you see other parts also of Qumran back toward the mountains. This direction over here, right back through here, if I'm not mistaken, is where Cave 1 was. So you can kind of see about how far apart they are. Now, if you advance the video just a little bit, now we're a little bit further away from where we were. And so we're kind of standing over by some of the caves. I want to show you this cave in particular right here. This is called Cave 4, and it's actually divided into two parts, Cave 4A and Cave 4B. And this is the cave where they found the majority of the scrolls, or at least the greatest quantity of scrolls and fragments. We'll show you a picture in just a minute. But that's about how far it is. You see the distances here? That's about how far it is. Here's the community up here, maybe 100 yards away or so, 150. And then right there, they went across this ravine and hid them in this cave and many others all along here. And then, of course, if you keep on spinning around again, then again, you see the Dead Sea off to the east. And then we look here. Let's see if we've got some more. Still there. Yeah, I guess that's the only two sections we have of Qumran. So I guess to me, the most fascinating thing is to think about these caves, and it'd be really great to get to go into those caves someday, but it's a lot harder to do it today than it was before. Okay, so we'll stop that share and come back to our PowerPoint. Now, if you look through some of the documents, you can actually go online today And you can see many parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Google has entered in a project where they're digitizing all the Dead Sea Scrolls so that we'll have copies of all of them in great detail that you can zoom in and study with as much clarity and definition as possible. And this is a picture of one part of the Isaiah scroll. And the Isaiah scroll is really unusual because it was very long. It was the complete book of Isaiah. Although it has some pieces missing to it, it's still largely intact. And you can go see that in the Israel Museum, at least parts of it, if you want to go. And all these letters here that are just to the left of the manuscript, all these right here, the MS stands for manuscript, and then it has a whole system of how you identify which part of the manuscript and which lines you're talking about. Here's a more closer up view of it. Hebrew, of course, goes from right to left, and so you see the ancient Hebrew script here from that time period, 1st century BC in this case, so before the time of Christ. And then this is the room that I mentioned before. That's the scriptorium. Not a very large room, but they've actually found like little inkwells here and even some of the things they would write with as well, some of the nibs and everything. And they would just be in here several hours a day, very carefully reciting and writing down word by word, letter by letter, the word of God so that they would get it right. Often if they made a mistake, they wouldn't just scratch it out, they would start over. So great detail, and you can see with that kind of reverence and care for the text, how we still have pretty much the same text 2,000 years later. Now, if you go up to Cave 1, I haven't done this, but this is a picture taken from within Cave 1. You see about how far away the Dead Sea is from the cave. If you go to Cave 4, a little bit closer up view than the video just a minute ago, you see the opening to Cave 4. You see that part of the roof has collapsed in here, Caves 4A and B. And inside, this is what it looks like. And as I said, this is where they found the greatest quantity of the scrolls and the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then this is a picture of Kando inside the antiquities store that his family now has. He actually was a cobbler, but also a dealer in antiquities, and he was licensed by the Israeli government, especially after he gave them some of the scrolls, a license to be an antiquities dealer. And so this is a picture in that store, and we met his grandsons, and we heard some of the story from them. Very interesting tradition there. Now, as you go through the story and you learn more about the scrolls, they're still looking to see if there's actually more out there. And they've recently investigated several new caves and found evidence that there were some jars in some of the caves, but didn't find any more scrolls just yet. And there's also portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were locked away in safes. There are different places around the world, different families possess some of them still, and as you can imagine, they're immensely valuable. And I believe the family of Kando still has some of the Dead Sea Scrolls from that time. So you see this kind of Google map image shows you a lot of the places where they found some of the remnants of the Dead Sea Scrolls, even far north of the Dead Sea over here. This is Sibley Kando. He's Kando's grandson, and he was showing our tour group different things that they have there. What he's showing in his hand there is a 1st century oil lamp from the time of Jesus. And there's many other interesting and valuable things in this store. It was fascinating just to browse around and learn about different things that they had there. And Sibley and his brother were very friendly people as well. Now, if you notice in the background, there's a case, a glass and wood case, with a big pottery jar inside of it. And if you go up closer, this is actually, as I understand it, the original jar in which they found the Isaiah scroll. And so if you look at this, you've got the pottery jar, and then you have the lid of the pottery jar right here. And they've actually used that as a model for part of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, bottom right here. You see that it looks like you have a pottery jar lid, and you have fountains kind of falling on this all day long to help maintain the temperature inside. And the idea is that if you could lift this roof with your finger, reach down and lift it up with your hand, that you would uncover the scrolls of the Dead Sea. And if you go inside this particular part of the museum, then you can see all of the scrolls, or at least a good part of the scrolls there, and other old documents that they found. So again, this is one of the treasures of Israel, especially in the museum. If you go inside, here's what it looks like. And as you see from inside, looks like the jar, the lid of the jar. And then right here you have what is like a scroll, end of a scroll standing up. So theoretically you could grab that and pick it up and then unroll the scroll and read part of the Old Testament that's there from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if I'm not mistaken, this right here is from the scroll of Isaiah. And they kind of trade out which parts they're displaying. They're very careful about the light and no flash photography, and about the temperature and the humidity to preserve all the scrolls as well as they can. And then they even trade out the amount of time that a particular scroll is exposed to the light and is displayed there, so that none of them wear out too fast. Also, at that same museum, there are a couple of, well, more than one, but some sculptures that represent part of what the community of Qumran talked about in other documents they found. One had to do with the battle of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. And so you see here the black wall, the sons of darkness versus the sons of light, the white there in the background. And again, this and other documents described some of the life and the ongoing problems and conflicts that the Essenes had with other groups at the time. And one interesting thing that many scholars have pointed out is that the Essenes, their practices about how they ate and how they did things as a community, actually are very similar to practices of the early church in the first century. And so they wonder how much the Essenes and people like John the Baptist influenced the early church as it developed just years later. And we know that the Essenes were living and working during the time of Christ, obviously. And so they would have impacted then the early church that was started in about 33 AD. Briefly, I want to just show you two more quick pictures that have to do with the Essenes and Qumran. The guy on the left is a guy from Argentina. He was actually a conservative rabbi, and right now he has been the curator of the Dead Sea Scrolls for 25 years. And the guy to the right is a man from one of our groups who introduced me to Adolfo, the guy on the left, Guillermo Palestina. He is from Mexico, and he was able to help us get a couple of lectures from Adolfo Reutemann to our group on 2 nights during our trip. And then later on other trips, we went back and Adolfo was our tour guide through the museum, through parts of the Israel Museum. And that was a great honor to be able to hear it from the curator of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So obviously a man with a lot of responsibility there. And then our institute here, the Texas International Bible Institute, had a seminar and invited Dr. Reutemann to talk about Jerusalem and the temple in ancient Israel. And so you see part of his PowerPoint and some of the students that were taking the seminar that day, a 6-hour seminar with Dr. Reutemann. So again, a fascinating study about this group of Essenes who had such an impact on the first century and also the preservation of part of our Bible that we have today. Well, that's the end of our first part of the important groups during the time of Jesus. We'll come back in the next video and discuss 4 other groups that Jesus dealt with during this time. I'll see you then.